All right. Hi, everyone. Well, good afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for the second episode of Misplaced. As a reminder, this is a series that looks at misplacements in the food systems and a series of talks with advocates and innovators that tell us how we can solve these problems. So last week in our first episode, if you tuned in, we talked to Dr. Daisy Tam, and she has highlighted two major issues in the food system: food waste and food security. We'll hear a little bit more about food security today because we are joined by Paul Newnham to advance this conversation. We will talk about the future and how food is key to achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So, hi, Paul. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. I'll steal the screen for one more minute to, tell a little bit more about you to our audience. So, Paul is the director of the SDG2 Hub, where SDG2 stands for Sustainable Development Goal number 2, which is zero hunger. So, Paul and the SDG2 Hub are on a mission to coordinate global campaigning and advocating to achieve these goals. To do so, they bring together NGOs, advocacy groups, civil society, the private sector, and UN agencies. So through this initiative, Paul seeks to generate change that will impact our food system and our planet. To this end, the SDG2 facilitates also the new Good Food for All narrative and the Chef's Manifesto. These are both initiatives that we'll hear a little bit more and learn a little bit more about today, thanks to Paul. So Paul, please, the screen is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here, and I'm looking forward to chatting. If you haven't checked out the first episode that was on last week, I just watched it earlier. It's definitely worth checking out. This is a great series and a great connection. So just going to share a few slides as we present. But yeah, it's really great to be here, and I have the opportunity to really work on really furthering the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you don't know what the Sustainable Development Goals are, they're a set of goals that was created in 2015 by the United Nations, where every world leader got together and signed on to. These 17 goals are designed to be a roadmap, a plan of action that shows the interconnectedness of our world and the issues, and a plan for how we can get certain things back on track and really move forward. And so these 17 goals have a range of targets under them, and they've been created as that platform for us. They were signed on in 2015 and they go through to 2030. And so we've got just under a decade now to go on those goals. And that's challenging because, as I'll talk about, so there is some challenges that we're facing. And at the SDG2 Advocacy Hub, we particularly focus on goal 2, but we don't just stop there. We also are concerned about all of the goals and the connection to them. And this is really important for a range of different reasons. Mainly the reason is because the way that we produce and eat food is going to determine if we achieve these goals. And so looking at this shows the 17 goals, and it shows also how each goal has a connection to the food and agriculture space. The goals are really about an inclusiveness to leave no one behind, and that goes around the goals. But if you look at the goals, even though, zero hunger obviously connects to food and agriculture, but you also have to think about, health. We all know now that good health starts with a nutritious diet. If we think about education, you can't really concentrate or learn if you're not getting the right nutrients. Right through to gender and, the rights of who owns land. Going across into inequality and access, looking at climate change and how agriculture responds to climate change and the impacts there. Thinking about so many elements, life below water and a whole blue food space, and how so many people in the world rely on the ocean for food, but they also rely on it for their livelihoods. And so all of these elements, as you look at them, you can understand a little bit more about how the SDGs really are connected in such an intimate way to the way that we produce and eat food. And so this is something that I think is really relevant to this series and to the conversation today, but also the point in time that we're at in our world. And so as we think about food, you know, there's a lot of people will have different experiences, and depending on where you are in the world will depend on what time it is, how you're feeling, whether you're feeling hungry, whether you're thinking about food, whether you have the option of food, and the way our food system works is it has very different experiences, but it's very connectedly to all of us as humans, because we all need food. We all need to eat, and we all experience that in different ways, depending on where we are from, depending on our background, depending on our experience, our family, our religion. All these elements input into the understanding that we have of food. And when you talk about good food, you all think about that in different. It also has lots of challenges when you think about it. So food systems really touch so many parts of our lives, but they also bring lots of different challenges and opportunities. So there's areas we've talked about: food security, and that was brought up, food waste, malnutrition, hunger, food system stunting, ecosystem wasting, obesity, hidden hunger. There's so many wide-ranging and food-related problems that exist that also can be seen as opportunities. And often when you start to talk about that, it can get very technical very quickly. And particularly when you get into food system conversations, it can often get quite technical, and everyone's experience will bring a different starting point to that. And so this is part of the reason we've started to think about talking about it, to talk a bit about the idea of good food. And I'll tell you a little bit more of that in a minute. But I think, you know, as we think about food, we also need to think about the different elements that we're all fighting for. So food is something that connects the dots. It ties into many of the issues. And so one of the things that we do at the SDG2 Advocacy Hub is we run a network with chefs, and chefs are really great connectors around food. Chefs connect with the people that grow the food, and then they connect to people that eat food. And they often understand the complexity of the food system. And you have all different types of chefs, from school canteens to workplace chefs, to fine dining, to soup kitchens and food kitchens. And so there's all kinds of different experiences, but they bring this connection, and they connect some of the issues, from biodiversity to malnutrition, to sustainable agriculture, to regenerative agriculture. All of these elements come in. And in amongst that, there's lots of people, you know, fighting for different things. And when I say fighting, I mean not fighting with each other. They're standing up for different issues. And it's really important to have people active around food and to be advocating in this space. And obviously, as an advocacy hub, we're really keen to encourage people to speak out, to encourage people to use their voice, and to think about the Sustainable Development Goals as a plan that they can tie that advocacy to. But it's really important that as we think about that we also think about the connections of our food system, because it creates the energy, it creates the space for us to really drive some of these other challenges, from climate change to equality and other issues. And so what I want to do is I'm just going to drop in a video. And this video just introduces some of the language that we've used for this good food conversation. And I think it just helps to frame up a little bit about some of the intersections that are there. So we're just going to play a short video. So as you can see, this is just a campaign that's really built around trying to connect it with the elements of what good food does, that how good food begins with farmers, that it's nutritious, really, but to try and highlight some of the issues that food really connects with. And this is really critical, and it was launched just late last year. But obviously now, with the pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic, we've just seen so many shifts. We've seen so much of the invisible of our food system become visible. We've seen empty shelves in places where people had not seen empty shelves. We've seen things like milk being poured down the drain, food rotting in fields. And at the same time, we've seen hunger, malnutrition, and obesity numbers all increasing. And so at the moment, it's more critical than ever because we're really at risk of losing 5 years of progress on the Sustainable Development Goal 2 particularly. And in many parts of the world, almost all parts of the world, there's really major challenges. And that's because, you know, as we've been able to address, issues around hunger in certain parts, we've also very quickly addressed that in ways that's also had unintended consequences, where there's been obesity rises and environmental inputs. And so we need to get much more sophisticated in the way that we're addressing some of these issues and see the system in the world as more connected. And so 2021 is a really critical year. It's a critical year for us, not only because of the year that's been, and because we're at the beginning of this decade of action and really driving forward change, but it's also, there's a number of opportunities that exist. And one of the key opportunities in 2021 is that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for a UN Food Systems Summit. And so this is a global summit to really look at how do we accelerate action on the sustainable goals, but do it in such a way that looks through the issues around our food system to drive change. And that can be from, gender to education to energy through to food and agriculture in those areas. And so this UN Food Systems Summit started last year, and it's being launched, and it's a summit which obviously will have events, and there's going to be an event in the middle of the year in Italy and then in New York. There'll be elements, obviously, probably virtual and physical of some sort, depending on where the world is. But it's a summit that's a people summit that's already started, and it's a summit that's been created with lots of on-ramps online. And so there's things like there's a food systems community which you can join, and you can get on there and talk with other activists. You can become a food systems hero. And then just last week, there was launched this new food system dialogues toolkit for independent dialogues. And so it's a toolkit to enable conversations around the world around the food system and the impacts that it has. And so there's all these on-ramps, and this means that there's a huge opportunity for you to engage, to get involved, and to be part of the conversation. And so I want to encourage people to join us in the fight in fighting for good food for all. Raise your voice locally, nationally, globally. Think about what you're eating, how it impacts people and planet. Gather together to discuss the ways you engage with food. Listen and learn to things like this Misplaced series, to really lean in and really look at what's going on, and then use that to advocate and drive and shape the systems through the choices that you make, and how you look at the spaces that you're in. So I think I'll leave it there, but I just really want to encourage you to lean in, check out the UN Food Systems Summit, check out Good Food for All, and see if you can get engaged.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Paul. That was a great introduction to this chat. Touched upon a lot of points showing that the food systems are very much interconnected to quite a lot about our future and about the future of our planet. I'd like to maybe start by picking up one of your initiatives there and ask you a little bit about the Chef's Manifesto. We think it's really interesting, of course, and we understand the gist of it, chefs advocating for good food and bringing it to the table. But maybe you can give us like a nice example of what is, tangibly being done that has an effect and that could encourage other chefs to join.
Yeah, so the Chef's Manifesto is a framework which is created by chefs for chefs that connects to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And so it's very much grounded in this plan for the world, and it creates actions that are tangible that people can take in their own kitchens, they can take in the choices they make, in how they advocate. And so a few examples are, we have chefs that are really advocating on biodiversity, for example, where they're looking at crops that are using less water, that are more nutritious, better for people and planet. And so one of the examples is a chef, Pierre Thiam, who is a Senegalese chef based in New York. He has restaurants in New York and Nigeria, but he's also set up a food company called Yeleli Foods, and they're promoting funio. And they use funio, and funio is a small millet that grows with very little water, but it's highly nutritious. And so he's making that accessible, which stimulates livelihoods, but it also stimulates better nutrition options and choices. So that's just one example. We have other chefs that are looking at the food waste issue. We have other chefs that are looking at livelihoods. We have chefs that are really looking at things, oceans and seafood and blue food. And so there's others that are driving biodiversity and plant-based ingredients. And so the framework enables people to make choices about how they engage and what they do.
Fantastic. Yeah, that sounds like a great program, and would definitely like to follow what these chefs do. I believe there's at least an Instagram account where one can follow their conversations, right? So we do encourage you guys to go and check it out. There's like plenty of nice chats going on there. I think this initiative is amazing, but my question is, okay, now we got chefs gathered. What do you think is going to be the next profession or the next big player in the food system that should come up with a manifesto?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think, the idea of taking the goals create the framework, but how you then apply them is really important. So how do you apply them to different professions? How do you contextualize them and think about them? And so, there's been lots of conversation about a farmer's manifesto, and there are different versions of this. I also think, though, companies and business really need to engage, and there are a number of platforms that they're engaging on. But I do think, really thinking about how they engage in supply chain, what that looks like, how they think about how to respond to some of these challenges. You see lots of action, sometimes really addressing, we're starting to see lots of companies thinking about the climate issue, really trying to drive innovation in that space. But I think, sometimes the ambition needs to be bigger. We need to move faster. And you see that sometimes in smaller startups, in more innovation. But at the bigger end of town, we need to see people doing things that address one or two issues at once. And so it's not just about addressing, one thing, but it's also addressing like people and planet. So nutrition and environment at the same time, looking at biodiversity. And so, that's really important. Thinking about from the supply chain, there's many companies that are doing that, even large to small. I know I saw a program that Kellogg's is looking at on origins, helping farmers, implement sustainable agricultural practices so they can responsibly source ingredients into some of the products they do. There's other big groups. There's like Unilever has done this Future 50 Foods, which is with WWF, which is foods that are good for people and planet. So there's all these kinds of different experiences, and I think it's important. But I would say, we all need to really look at these goals and say, what can we do? Not all do everything, but all choose some things to contribute in the choices that we make.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that leads me also to the next question, right? It's the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and we've seen that the food system or food is somehow related to all of them. You are an advocate for the SDG2 in particular, but of course seeing the interconnectedness. How would you recommend that we as consumer pick our goal, our focus, our strength, if you want?
Yeah, I mean, look, as consumers, it's really important to kind of not overwhelm yourself. So it's thinking through what can you actually do. And sometimes it's small shifts. If we think about something like biodiversity, at the moment globally, 60% of all calories consumed are from 4 crops, 4 things. There's 30,000 edible plants in the world, and the majority of our diets only come from 150. So even just making small shifts of 1 or 2 things into your diet, switching some things in your diet, can actually make a big difference. And so, you know, there's lots I mentioned just before the Future 50 Foods, which is 50 foods that have been designed as good for people on the planet. Those kinds of foods, just making switches where you use, you know, some beans instead of, you know, some meat in a dish that you normally cook, or adding a couple of extra ingredients. We often add seeds and, you know, things like that to different ingredients, to different dishes. And it's not hard. It actually makes food more interesting. It makes it taste better. It gives you better texture. And so obviously, depending on where you are, your experience, your access, not everyone has access to do this. But I suppose what I would say, everyone has choices that they can make. And I've seen that from refugee camps right through to fine dining. And you know, people do have choices, and they choose what they eat. You know, they choose to eat things that they enjoy. And in those choices, there's things that we can do. And so there's different days, you know, there's like an Eat for Good day just recently, and there's work, you know, Earth Day is another one where people choose to think about energy and think about that. So, you know, use those days to try and start to develop patterns, to start to change the way you think and the way you engage.
Yep. Awesome. Thanks for that. I'm looking at time, and we have 6 more minutes, and I wanted to make sure that we address some audience questions if they come through. I think I see one here, so we'll have it pop up on the screen. So people's concept of good food changes through time. Thinking back, I was amazed by how much meat my parents ate. Do you think we should not base our action on people's idea of good food today? And this is from Newhnam.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good question. I grew up, you know, in the same. I'm from Australia, and you know, it was like meat and 3 vegetables on a plate, and it was very traditional. And so you would choose what animal protein you would eat, and that's how you made your dish. And so it'd be like, you're going to have lamb and something, or beef and something, or chicken and something. There's many of us that have grown up in that experience. Now, I think at the time, I didn't have an awareness of the impact that that was making. Now I would say what we have to do is we have to look at the available science. We have to look at the fact that science is telling us that we need a more diverse diet for health and for the planet. And that diversity needs to include also more animal-based, more plant-based products, more plant-based dishes. And we need to reduce the size and the frequency of animal-based products. Things like fish are better than some, you know, there's different types. I'm not a believer in saying you shouldn't eat certain things, because I think as soon as you do that, you get into a very dangerous conversation, because people just switch off and it becomes very ideological. What I prefer to say is you have to look at the science and then make a decision. But there's certain directions that we have to go in. And so sometimes it's about just looking at your own diet, what's on your plate, and how is that constructed. So we've become very much plant-based since, you know, working in this space and learning the science. And so we would only occasionally eat some animal-based products. We will eat some eggs, but, you know, that's a choice we've made based on what we know. But in some parts of the world, there needs to be a little bit more animal-based products, or a little bit more of a diversity in diet, because, you know, an egg, the difference between micro and macronutrients for somebody living in a particular part of the world that doesn't have diversity or that opportunity. And so I think you've got to take it case by case and use some of that nuance to really think about that. But I would say, you know, that it's important that we need to be informed from the past, but then also look into the future and be informed by the science, and then make a decision. We don't want to stick in the past with the tradition that we've had. But I would say also that if you do look backwards, there's so many cool traditions that are really good for the planet.
What would be, in your opinion, one of the traditions of the past that we've kind of lost and that are actually climate smart, right, in terms of food choice, like you would define it?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on which part of the world you go back into, but there's often lots of different cultures and societies where food, was gleaned, so people gathered foods from different parts. If we go back to the hunter-gatherer kind of space, people would gather different things that were very seasonal. And so seasonality became very, very important. And I think what we've become used to is like we want blueberries all year. Well, blueberries don't grow all year. And so the food system has adapted to grow them for us. And that's just one extreme example, or avocado or something else. And so if you think about eating foods according to the seasons in the part of the world that you're in, it's going to shift your diet. And so that's a simple thing that if you look backwards, that I think we can learn from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a really good rule of thumb to look at sustainable foods, think seasonally. What I think it's fun is that, for example, I don't even remember anymore what is supposed to be seasonal, what is supposed to be in season right now. We were having this conversation with our colleagues just a couple of days ago, and we had to Google it. So we lost a little bit, right? We lost a bit touch with what is supposed to be in season, but it is definitely a good recommendation. Well, thanks for that.
Yeah.
All right. So we are right on time, and I think it's a good moment to wrap up with this suggestion for our audience. Although another question popped up, so if you have an extra minute, we might get back through to you. Okay, perfect timing. I'm interested in sustainability and the goals. I want to contribute towards these goals. I love what your advocacy hub is achieving. It's really interesting. Could I know more about your background? I'm assuming she's referring here about your personal career background and how you got to become such a good advocate.
Yeah, look, thank you. Look, I studied international and community development. I grew up traveling around the world, and so I working in different parts of the world. And so I kind of got exposed to lots of culture. And so I came at the world from seeing the beauty of different cultures and seeing the opportunity that different cultures bring. They bring different knowledge, they bring different experience. And so what that enables you to do is when you understand those cultures, you can learn more about yourself, what's good and what's bad, also about the culture that you're in and how that shapes you. And so I kind of studied that, and then from that moved into the community development space, which is really understanding how do you help communities discover the answers that they have for the problems that they have. When you're in the middle of it, it's very hard to see that. And so it's about helping ask questions that can help people think through what's going on around them and how they can then respond. And so that's kind of a little background. And then I worked for a big international NGO for a number of years, working in engaging there. Learned a lot about advocacy and through that, ended up at the UN working for the World Food Programme, and then got asked to sort of lead this Sustainable Development Goal 2 Advocacy Hub. But it's really, I'd say the key thing is to be really open, to have a breadth of experience, and to look and engage. And obviously an interest in food. I'm really interested in food and gardening and growing things and really getting my hands dirty in that way. And so that's kind of more my hobby, is getting out there, cooking, growing, engaging. That really informs, I think, some of the work that I do now.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Paul. And I'd like to leave you with a brief question. As you know, Misplaced is a pretty connected series, so one conversation follows the other. Next week, we are meeting actually here in Hong Kong with Paul Fabrega from Rooftop Republic. And I wonder if you can share with us, what would you like to learn from him and from his experience?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is thinking about cities and how, as we move into urban environments, what the food system looks like and where the future is heading. Because often what happens is people feel very disconnected. So I'd be interested to understand, how is their connections being developed into the food system and understanding for people living in cities.
Fantastic. Well, we'll pass the question on, and we thank you very much, Paul, again for joining us. And I'd say we can bring our episode to a conclusion. We're meeting our audience again next Tuesday, so please tune in. You can simply follow our YouTube, and if you have watched this episode today, know that there's feedback. We're looking for your feedback, so please do fill it out, because you can also win some competitions.